Chapter 22. Into the Blanket of Light. Matias had made a wrong decision by turning around. He was planning to stay in the annex before dinner time to finish his pile of work. In hindsight, nothing had changed in his plan, at least until he left the annex. Matters were thrown into disarray after he twisted his body to look behind and found himself standing on the road leading to the gardener's cottage. Matias halted, pausing in his footsteps with a pensive look on his face. The days had marched on as they should. Everything went off without a hitch, and in an orderly fashion. Her tears on that night had also been washed away, and cleaned off all traces of his foreign feeling. Matias expanded his stride and strolled through the shady forest path. He tugged at his tie and loosened it, then pushed open a few buttons on his tight-fitting shirt. His gestures were a bit rougher, and he wasn't as calm as he always was. It was sickening. He loathed these emotions that were out of his track. It was aggravating for him to be plagued with feelings he couldn't curb. Matias wanted everything in his world to be in its place. So did his own feelings. That's the reason why he had never been enamored of a creature called a woman. In his orbit, the lust for sex was simply an instinct. He had never dwelled on it, or been swayed by it. Rather, it was cumbersome nothing more than a need to be adequately satisfied and dried away. Such desires, to begin with, didn't rule the roost in his mind. That's how the annoyance and discomfort he felt because of Leela grew and wreaked havoc on his stable world. Only she now could be in his world. His whole 5 senses were fixed on her, and blinding passion welled up deep inside him uncontrollably. There were often times when his gluttonous desire and lustful thoughts to possess her became too much for him to handle. Matias was displeased as he learned he was obsessed with such trivial things. He couldn't even put it on his list of priorities. Leela Llewellyn was a good-for-nothing who belonged to that league. Still, he needed to make sure. The long line of the forest trees gradually petered out as the cottage building grew closer. Pondering, Matias walked into the blanket of light. The jolly beam of summer sunlight was drifting down, permeating his eyes through the slats of twigs. Leela had found a baby bird sprawled on the ground. She was traveling home after sending Kyle off, when she suddenly heard the sound of a helpless squeal. Leela spotted a fallen baby bird under a tree in the backyard, a tiny, fragile nestling that had just recently had its feathers begin to grow.
"Oh, did you fall?"
Leela wrapped the baby bird with a careful touch and raised her eyes, looking up at the tree, precisely as she had thought. There was a bird's nest sighted in one of the tree's limbs. The tree loomed quite high, but thankfully, the baby bird wasn't severely injured.
"It's okay, I'll take you home."
Leela petted the baby bird gently and tucked it into her apron's pocket. She hurried back to the cottage to take the ladder stashing in the warehouse. She securely leaned the ladder against the tree and started climbing up. The nest was nestled between branches higher than the ladder, so she had no choice but to clamber further. Climbing that high usually had never been a problem for her, but with the baby bird in her pocket, Leela became more circumspect in her movements and couldn't be as nimble as usual. After ascending the closest bough to the bird's nest, Leela snatched the branch with one hand and thrust the other into her pocket. She painstakingly stretched her arms as far as she could and safely handed back the baby bird to its nest. Too bad. Just as she breathed a sigh of relief, her foot suddenly slipped off, and she lost her grip on the branch. The world spun upside down in a split second as her body bounced and lost its balance. She had managed to grab the branch's end and hold it tight, but the ladder had dropped to the ground. Alas, the branch that was too weak to support her body weight started making a crackling sound.
"Uncle! Uncle Bill!"
The terrified Leela reflexively screamed aloud, but her shout was met by the silence that she realized Uncle Bill wasn't at home.
"Kyle!"
Though she knew Kyle had walked too far and couldn't hear it, Leela kept crying and calling out to him. Kyle was her only hope when Uncle Bill wasn't here, because they were the only ones who would come to help her when she was in trouble.
"Leela."
Suddenly, a familiar voice appeared out of nowhere. The mellow voice called out her name, softly, as if singing a song. Her mind had turned white with fear, but Leela could still recognize the owner of the voice. She lowered her frightened gaze, and someone she knew was standing right below her. Duke, her heart. With an unbothered state, his eyes strayed at the fallen ladder and calmly watched her hanging precariously on the half-broken tree branch. He laughed, asking her,
"Shall I save you?"
"That crazy person. Why does it have to be him of all people?"
No. No need.
Even amidst her fear, Leela flatly refused his offer of help. She knew it was a long shot, but she tried to swing herself over towards the trunk of the tree, hoping that she could wrap her arms and legs around it. All this accomplished, however, was to cause the branch to crack even more. Terrified, she screamed.
Kyle! Kyle!
Her cries mingled with fright, calling for Kyle reverberated through the Arvis's forest. Matias giggled at a peak. He turned to look down the path that the young man had gone.
"He's not coming,"
he said, and relaxedly folded his arms. No matter how heartless he is, doesn't he feel the least bit concerned when he sees people in danger? Leela soon understood that astounding fact about the person standing before her. He was Duke of her heart. That insane Duke wouldn't be able to have a reasonable mind like a normal person.
Go away!
She snapped at him in annoyance and shooed him away.
If you're not willing to help, just go. Why are you still standing there?
"It seems you're gonna fall. I'll call someone to save you."
What? What did you say?
"And not such a heartless person, Leela.
Matias's lips curved into a drowsy grin.
I'll call Mr. Etman, whom you are calling desperately."
Seriously? His voice could no longer be heard as the noise of her panting breath had drowned it out.
Well, and let me see. What am I gonna do? Looking at the height. I think it's better to call Dr. Etman instead."
Oh! She had the urge to shout insults at the Duke, but her social position didn't allow this. Just as she was thinking that she would rather fall than beg him for help, her fear got the better of her, and she found herself shouting,
Ah! Save me!
Leela wailed in despair.
"Are you sure?"
Matias asked, leisurely taking off his coat.
"Call me then.
What?
Call me."
He took a few steps towards the tree, then stopped again and looked up at her. He seemed unwilling to lift a finger to save her from falling, unless she met his demand. Leela knew full well that he was capable of such heartless inaction.
Duke, please!
Leela begged him with teary eyes, and her voice miserably sobbing.
Duke!
Her plea grew more despondent as the moment for her fall drew nearer. After she hailed him for the millionth time, the branch ended up broken. She fell. Leela's mind went blank. Her vision became hazy as her body floated down from the tree. In contrast to the casualness with which he had been watching, the moment she started falling, he swiftly ran to just the right spot, where he was able to catch her. The force of the impact knocked him to the ground, but even then he held onto her tightly. The dirt and dust broom clouding them colliding on the soil gradually dissipated. Leela's head was buzzing, but slowly she got her consciousness back. Soft. It felt pillowy and unbelievably cozy, even though she had fallen from an elevated place. Leela opened her eyes. The warmth she felt belonged to a man, whom she had unknowingly hugged tightly. Duke Hareheart lay underneath her, and she was blanketed safe and sound in his arms. Her chest was pressed against his, and she could feel his heart beating. His arms were still firmly wrapped around her back and the back of her head. As she furtively lifted her head, she detected a faint minty scent of water coming from the nape of his neck. His skin was smooth and warm, and mantled with a wonderful fragrance. The heat, which had started from her cheek, quickly dispersed throughout her body in no time. It gave Leela a startled shudder when her body started to reheat. She wrestled her hardest to escape from him, glossing over the shame as their bodies were entwined in a close knot. He was too big and too hefty. She started struggling to try to free herself. but the more she struggled, the tighter he held her.
Stay still,
He quietly ordered in a breathy voice. But her resistance only grew stronger. No, she thought, shuddering. That is ridiculous. I don't want to hold still. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Meanwhile, Matias's body was growing warmer as well. He gripped her back and head even more tightly. All these sensations were strange and unfamiliar to her, and she couldn't stand it. Flooded with visceral fear, she tried her hardest to get free. But the more she tried, the more helpless she felt. No matter what she did, she couldn't push him away. Just as her fear was reaching its height, she saw his ear in front of her. Without heed of, she blindly bit the Duke's ear. Groaning in pain, he pushed her off of him. He then looked over at her, and was perplexed to see that she was trembling, even though she was the one who had just attacked him. With the same cheeky look in his eyes, he soon started laughing. Leela's vivid green eyes glared at him ferociously, acting as she wanted to rip him into pieces.
Be a lady, Leela.
Suddenly his hand that had been rubbing his ear reached out and grabbed her by the hair. Before she knew what was happening, she was lying face up on the ground. All she could see was his face staring down at her.
So this is what I get in return after saving your life. Don't you think it's too unladylike?
Why should I be ladylike when you're not even a gentleman?
Leela turned her face aside. Embarrassment was splotching her cheeks with red color as she tried to push his body one more time. But Matias had snatched her chin with his scorching hot hand and dragged her face to his.
Didn't your mouth just say I was a gentleman?
No, I misspoke.
Did you?
A gentleman, huh? It's hogwash. If you're a gentleman, how can you do this?
Leela stammered with a face that was going to break into tears and struggled to get away from him. Matias's eyes narrowed. A small furrow formed between his eyebrows as he looked at Leela rubbing her lips as if they had been polluted with something filthy.
Please, step aside.
Leela glared at him with a sullen look invading her face.
Something like this,
A shrill scream came out, letting the last syllable hang in the air. Matias had lowered his head and bit back her ear. All happened in a snap. Taking her tiny hands that were trying to hit and claw at him and pressing them to the ground, he was now holding her ear in his mouth. When he began to lick her earlobe, she started to pant and scream, having originally simply intended to pay her back for biting his ear. He changed his mind and pushed her down forcefully. Sobbing and gasping for air, she writhed as he hit her earlobe even harder. He used his full body weight to pin down her flailing limbs as he left several bite marks on her reddened ears. A satisfied smile presented on his face after he saw Leela's messy countenance. Her innocent eyes were soggy, transparently swollen with tears. Her slightly open lips, which were even darker than its hackneyed shade, gulped in a lungful of heavy air. Matias tightly clutched her crumbly intertwined fingers and pressed his lips against hers. Astonished by his sudden kiss, Leela firmly clenched her lips, but Matias had easily dispatched her resistance. This sweltering summer would end by soon enough. Matias perfectly got the picture. Still, it didn't stop him. He stuck his tongue into her mouth lustfully. Moisture began to flow from their overlapping lips, along with the sound of gasps and moans.
AudiosKoppo